Hello everyone, we are here back again in the storytelling series, and today we are going to discuss something more about storytelling. So this is third of our storytelling series. So we have with us Kurt Cagle, Lynette Bernard and Lakshmi Natraj. All three of them are Amazon published authors, and today we are going to discuss few more interesting questions, and I would like you all to stay tuned with us because we are coming up with many more series and questions which will be fruitful to you. So today the questions that we are going to discuss are very basic questions about storytelling. They are like how to start a story, how to create a byline, how to create a premise, how to build characters, how to describe events. So these are very basic questions that comes up in mind when someone is writing an interesting story. So to begin with, I would like to uh, pop up this question to Lakshmi, and then we'll begin the discussion. So Lakshmi, since you do a lot of fictional writing, if you can tell us how a story can be started, how can we begin a story, an interesting story that can engage the audience?
The very first line or the first paragraph of the story has to be very interesting, and it depends upon to which crowd we are telling the story. So if it is a very small youngsters, children, we just had to get their attention. We ask a question like, what do you think a mountain which was very proud, what happened to that mountain one day? So the children are prepared. Visually, they see a mountain and they are ready to do. But when we are writing to audience, like what I write, crime thrillers, etc., the first, this one, again, you ask a question or you describe a situation where the people are just waiting for an answer. Like, she just opened the door and suddenly she felt a cold edge of a gun on her back. Typically, what happened when people are shivered? Or you say, she just opened the door and then found the body bleeding. So something like that. So it is so interesting right in the beginning.
Right from the word go, it is engaging the audience.
Then the story starts. So people getting the interest of the story is the beginning is very important. But if people are writing like general stories, which is not this one, like literature piece, historic piece, people write the beginning lot of description. Like suppose you are talking about a history, describe the palace, how there are carvings there and all that. But so mostly it should be very catchy.
So for fictional writing, the main idea should be that it should be catchy. So Lynn, since he also does some non-fictional writing, Lynn, how should we start a story? We are talking about a story. So how should it be started?
In my books, you know, the volumes, it's sort of got the one has got to like follow onto the other one. So that what Lakshmi was talking about now, that what you call that a pretense or something, where you fall right into the story with that one line, 1-2 sentences. That's what I put in my foreword. I can put it in my foreword. Because with my volumes, it's like a foreword, it's like addendums at the back, it's like about the book, about the author. You can put it that I see as putting it about the book. Now I'm going to explain about the book and how to read this book, so that I'm all, you know, going to put the suspense in there, you know. Hey, what's the story about the book, and how to read this book. Listen, especially in the forward, in this last one, I said something about dinosaurs. Because I wanted the people to know, listen, even dinosaurs, you know, they wouldn't have been extinct if they still had the right food, you know, something like that. And wow, what about dinosaurs? So, you know, I get it like right in the beginning before I start the story.
So about the chapter is also a thing that you do, or it is only like about the book? For every
Sorry?
about the chapters also, you build something before the chapter you begin, or just in the beginning about the book?
Yes, yes. Every chapter too has got that, you know, what is this about? In the beginning of the chapter, I'm going to throw something in, because like right at the beginning of this last book, I put a table there with all the countries, and listen, this country, the people live so long, the men live so long, and the ladies live so long. The ladies live like 4 or 5 years old, older than the men in every country. So that's
it's true.
immediately says like, yeah, that immediately says, hey, listen, you know, what is this all about?
Yeah, yeah. So I will also want to check with Kurt, since he also does a lot of professional writing. He has written for Forbes and written a lot of professional books. So Kurt, how should we begin a story, like in your point of view?
Yeah, I think Lakshmi has it exactly right. The idea, the idea in that first couple of paragraphs is to basically grab your readers by the scruff of the neck, hold them up high, and threaten them with bodily harm if they do not engage in the story right now. It's basically the point at which you're trying to engage them. You're trying to in a couple of paragraphs, get the essence of, the hook of the story in place. I mean, I've got my, the first chapter of my novel up, and I'll give you an example of this. So I have it as, doctors aren't supposed to write computer code. Of course, doctors aren't supposed to kill their patients either. My whole life of late seems to involve doing things I wasn't supposed to do. The window, the real one just behind the laptop screen, not the computer-based one I was staring at, flashed briefly, hinting at a thunderstorm in the making, though it was late for the season. October usually just brought sight gray skies and dismal rains in Seattle. A sullen teenage goth girl reimagines the city, kind of like me when it came right down to it. So 2 paragraphs. There's basically a sense of contradiction. There's a paradox. There's something that's intended to engage and grab the reader and immediately put them into a perspective where they're now seeing from that perspective they're now beginning to shift that perspective to the protagonist and seeing the story through those particular eyes. It also is a place where you can set some very basic context. And I know when I wrote this out originally, one of the critiquers that I had looking at it said, I didn't realize that this was a female character until almost 3 pages in. And I looked back at that and said, wait a second, that's fairly imperative in the story. It's important in the story. So I wanted to basically push the whole personality of that particular character into that first and second paragraph, to be able to immediately put you into her place, her perspective. And I think that's true in general. You really want, as Lakshmi did, and I think it's exactly the same thing. You want to get the point where you're immediately getting the character into the story. You can go in and fill in backstory as details and conversation and exposition over time. But realistically, that's your selling point. If you can't get your reader invested in those first 2 paragraphs, you've lost them.
Right.
True. Yeah, those first 1-2 paragraphs is most important.
Right.
Lakshmi, do you have a book of one of your books there where you can read us the first 2 paragraphs?
Unfortunately, yeah, I have a book.
Yeah, do that for us.
Yeah. So that would be like a live demonstration.
Okay.
See if it catches me.
Yeah. So she will get it and she will let us know. So
Okay.
Lakshmi,
We'll
once you have
continue.
the,
I will ask somebody to get
yeah,
it.
yeah, sure. So we'll move next to byline. So byline, I have heard, is very important since it reflects everything about the whole story or whatever is contained inside. So Lynn, if you can tell us like how do you create a byline for yourself, and then I will be coming to others.
For my nonfiction, it's basically medical nonfiction. I create the byline in my heading. I put the heading what this nonfiction is about. Okay, it's about complementary therapy or a whole medical system or whatever. So I give it that name, like orthopathy, the whole medical system. But now I'm talking about other things in this book. I'm talking about if you eat right, you are going to live longer. So I just extend that, that heading into a subheading. Orthopathy, the whole medical system, extending your lifespan. So that is my title of the book then, that whole title. So that actually says it's going to talk about orthopathy, the whole medical system, and it's going to talk about extending your lifespan. So that is how I do it in my heading, in my title.
Right.
So that you immediately know this book is about something else too.
Right. Interesting. So, Kurt, how do you do it? Like the byline part, since you do a varied form of writing, different stuffs you write.
Well, I think it's worth reflecting what exactly the purpose of the byline is. It's branding. It's something, and there's a difference between a byline and a synopsis. So I just want to make that clear. When you're
True,
talking
yes.
about a synopsis, you're basically talking about, give me in one paragraph or even one sentence
paragraph,
what
yeah.
the story is about. But the byline is usually, who am I and why am I important? What authority do I have to write this? And it for me, that authority is basically, I'm editor of the Kegel Report. And that's, I've got other things that I can write. I mean, my bio can get to be fairly extensive, but the only thing that really matters here is that particular point of saying, I'm the editor of the Kegel Report. It's what I want to emphasize to be able to promote my brand. And because of I'm emphasizing that brand, that's why I try to make sure that that's always, up front and immediate, because it essentially establishes, helps me to, when I write my next piece, to go back in and just reinforce that same concept, that same brand over and over again. So it's really important as a branding issue, and to do that, you need something very short, very sweet, and something that is going to stand out.
Right. Interesting.
It's good that Kurt is talking about branding, because that is the reason why I'm writing this trilogy, because I started these 3 therapies and I haven't trademarked them. So I thought, now how am I going to, keep it to myself so somebody else doesn't start this? So I thought, okay, write the trilogy about the 3 therapies. Then nobody else can say, I listen, I started arrow healing, and I started orthopathy, and I started arrowcology, because now I've got these books. They like my trademark. It's like branding, branding the therapies.
Right. So that's how you create a name, and then once you have a name, then people start joining and people start coming to know about you. So yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, Lakshmi, if you can tell us about byline, and then you can also, if you can read out, if you have that starting point of your story.
Actually, I think in fiction writing, there isn't much importance for a byline.
Okay.
And mostly when you are doing scientific thing, etc., the theory which you are going to prove, or your idea what you are going to deliver, that's byline is important. But in fiction, I don't think it's very important.
I would like to add one point here. Like I attended a workshop on by Oscar nominated Oscar nominated writer, and he was telling that when we start writing a movie or a web series, so he has also written Blood for Netflix. So he was telling that when we start writing a movie, many a times we start with a byline, or sometimes a byline becomes important because to production houses we can't send the whole story. We send them the byline, and if they like the byline, then they take up the story. So then, so that is
Yeah,
slightly
that
different.
is true. Very recently, I also learned that. That's
Yeah,
when you send to
Yes.
producer, etc. One line.
one line.
One
Yeah.
line. I didn't know that exactly is byline.
Yeah,
So
Yeah, I
I
don't
just
think
now
that
wrote
Story
even one
about.
of my story book in one line. Terrorist planning bio war with a DNA alteration. So that entire book is consisting one single line. So if the
Yeah.
producer is interested, then they can take the book that way.
right.
But I wasn't knowing exactly like that. You
Yeah.
write a byline.
So
yeah,
I
Claude
think
was
I'm not
it's
sure
saying,
just
that's
one line.
yeah,
I'm not sure that's actually a byline. I think that's a
okay,
synopsis.
okay,
Synopsis.
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Yeah,
probably
a
different,
synopsis or an
different.
abstract, that's, and those are a little different because the synopsis is basically what, it's an elevator pitch. It's
Abstract kind of.
the abstract. The
The
byline
abstract.
is basically just this is the person who wrote this particular piece
Right,
and what its qualifications are. But the abstract or the synopsis is
right,
usually what you're using to. Well, actually, it's one of two things. There's a promotional there's a promotional
right,
synopsis,
right,
which is basically a very short teaser,
right,
and that's
Teaser.
a
Yeah.
little bit different.
right,
But as far as that goes, it again comes down to, can you get something short and pithy that will
right,
attract the reader's
right,
interest? But it's probably a little less important in fiction, but
right,
it's still there.
right.
It's still in that case, it's usually what gets put on the back cover or
Right.
on the inside cover of
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
Like on my books, which I write on the back cover, I gotta give them, except my manuscript, I have to give them about the author, about
right.
the book, 100 words
Blur.
about the author, 100 words about the book. So I have to
Right.
count exactly, not more than 100. And they put that on the back of the book. If you look at my book, you can see on the back about the author, about the book. Is that
Right.
what we're talking about now? Yes.
Right,
But it's saying
right.
100 words exactly what this 800 pages is about,
Yeah, yeah.
Very
And that's
difficult
hard.
to do it.
It is real
Very
hard.
hard.
5 years
It's
story
very
in
difficult.
100 words. Yeah. But
I've
yeah,
written
like
so many before
terminology
I
is
send
different.
the manuscript off. I've written like 10 of them, and then I think, oh no, okay, send this one off now.
So they want the best one so that more and more readers might get attracted. The publishers
And
are
then they
always
publish the wrong one anyway.
true, true,
Yep.
true. So, Lasmi, if you have brought that your book, and if you can tell us how do you start if you can quote an example.
This is the
Okay, okay.
book.
So you sent me this one, yeah.
This is actually the hard copy book. Afterwards, I have written 2 more novels in e-book only.
Okay,
So this
Okay.
is how the story starts.
okay,
Jyotika Heights, one of the recent posh lifestyle apartment in Mumbai, was woken up this morning by Chotu's ear-piercing shrill scream. The petrified car cleaner boy was screaming at the highest pitch possible and blabbering, blood, blood, oh God, someone help. Chotu ran to Miss Ruby Joseph's house and rang the bell house of number 1601 continuously. Furious and irritated at being disturbed at such an early hour in the morning, Ruby yanked the door open and was about to give him usual mouthful of hate speech. But before that, the boy's terrified and shivering cried, Madam, madam, that professor's house door. Blood is all over. There, near the door. I went to collect the car keys and I saw the blood. Oh God, so much blood. Now Ruby was also shaken up. Picking up her house key and slamming her door shut, she followed the boy half running across the passage to her neighbor, Professor Dr. G.R. Bisra's.
Wow.
Yeah, no, that book I want to read.
So that's how you get an audience immediately.
Yeah, I want to know what's happening now. Half across a passage. Now that sounds very, very fast.
So you would not read
Very
from
good, very
backwards
good
this
start.
book?
And the greatest suspense in this book is the title of the book is A Bride, a Murder, and a Trail of Blood. So
Woo!
half the book is about
Hold it up
tortured
slightly.
bride. Yes?
Yeah,
Can you
yeah,
hear it?
yeah.
A tortured
Interesting.
bride. Half the story people have sympathy for a tortured bride and murdered, etc. But after half, the story completely takes a U-turn.
It takes a
Okay.
And
What do you call that?
at the
What do
end
you
of the
call that?
story, the suspense is there was no bride, there was no murder, and there was no
Woo!
marriage also. And how the professor was framed, and it is a revenge story.
And this book is the reason why I met Lasmi. So this book
Yeah.
is she
When it
had
was
sent me
being
this book
released,
for
we
review.
met.
She had sent me this book for review, and that's how we met. And then I also visited her place for her interview and all. But yeah, it was very interesting, this book, and I also gave an Amazon
Good.
review on this one. So Kurt, how did you feel like when she started, and as an audience, what do you think?
I think it's very engaging. That's you've done exactly what you need to do, which is to establish the character, to establish the focus, to tease the audience, and to basically set enough of the stage that they're immediately hooked. And that's the mark of a good opening.
Right. So one thing I would like to add here, like branding we were talking about. So Lasmi has a particular kind of audience with her, but that audience is not a very large scale. We see that people are from different countries are liking this, but then again, she is not able to reach out to many people because a publisher might not be interested. She is like going for self-publishing. Then that brand building is somewhere that we as authors also need to look up. So Kurt, since you have already published a lot of books, what do you think, like how an author can build upon after having done so much, after putting up so much of good efforts, what the author can do to build a brand better and reach out to more audience?
I wish I knew. I'd be doing it. Yeah, but I think there are several facets of that. It's actually a fairly complicated question. First of all, in order to be successful, one of the big things that you have to do is be consistent. It's never the first book that makes a writer. It's very, very seldom even the second book. It's the 5th or 6th or 10th or 20th book that actually gets them to the point where they become, established. And that's because what you're doing is essentially building, bringing people into your world, bringing people into the milieu that you're creating. And because of that, or bringing people into the topic that you're wanting and the mindset that you're trying to be able to promulgate. And that can't be done with a single book. All that you can do with that first book is to really plant the seed, but then you've got to spend time marketing. You have to spend time watering it, and I think that's one of the problems that you run into, and a lot of people run into. I run into myself as an author, is that they go in and they get 1 or 2 books published and think, well, I'm on my way to success. And the reality is usually that no, all you've done is basically gotten to the point where, okay, you're beginning to get readership, but that readership is going to be fickle. They're going to be impatient. They want what you have now. If you spend too long between getting books out, then they're going to lose interest. There have been a number of series that I've started, and very good books. I love them, but it was 5 years between book 3 and book 4, and by that time my tastes had changed, my interests had changed, and I didn't want to go back and reread the story just so I could find the next piece. And so I think that the real key to marketing yourself is just being consistent. As an editorial writer, I have to make sure that I'm publishing weekly. As a fiction writer, I need to be on a 3 to 6 month cycle. And that's for me anyway, that seems to be the case. You just have to basically get things out constantly and enforce you're there and build up your audience. And it's going to take time and effort. And if you don't put the effort in, you're not going to get anything out of it.
Right.
That's exactly true. What Kurt is saying is to be consistent. I know what you're talking about when you say that, sort of like 5 years in between, which is too long, And if I go and spend a weekend somewhere and I come back the Monday and I must start, writing, I've sort of lost track, and I have to sort of go back and, we were speaking about that. You have to live that role. You're going to have to live it for five years, if you only put out 5 years. I've heard about people saying they write nonfiction in 2 months. I don't know how they can do that, depending on how long the book is too,
So
but
that's
yes, it's important to be consistent.
Yeah, that's why people can't come together. Then that same set of minds and then writing with the same flow, it becomes really difficult.
Yeah.
Right.
Another thing is not to try and be perfect all the time, because perfectionists, I'm a perfectionist, and I listened to a speech yesterday on LinkedIn where this lady was saying, perfectionist, be consistent, don't be a perfectionist, just be consistent. Put something out there like every day, at least every day. And I'm thinking once a week is enough, but she says every single day you've got to put out something there.
Well, one of the things that you're seeing more and more authors do, and I think it's actually a pretty good idea, is that they're actually now putting out chapters of works as they get them out in kind of a this is a first alpha without we may actually go back in and edit things and clean them up, but what's happening there is that engagement now moves from something that's okay, every 6 to 8 months to okay, every 2 weeks here's an installment. It may not be very long, but it's something, and it keeps people's mind aware. It keeps them engaged. And again, to Lynette's point, that consistency. If you are constantly trying to write the perfect passage, you're going to lose that rhythm. And you really have to just keep at it, on a daily basis, and sometimes it's hard.
So just to add one thing, we were talking about Sushant Singh's case, and then Lakshmi added that if he was there in a series or a serial, things would have been like he would have been connected with the audience on a regular way. So once what you are saying is like if you write a chapter regularly, you are connected to audience in a regular way. You get feedbacks, you can improve. Right, Kurt?
Yeah, I think so. Go on,
that's also a very good idea.
Lakshmi?
Yeah, that's a very
Tell us a bit more. Yeah.
Actually, what I used to do is a part of that suspense of that story. I used to promote by actually getting a nice picture for that, and then like 2 or 3 lines. So the audience, those who are reading, they say, yeah, we are exciting to know what happened, like that. So I keep on posting about my entire book, but not when I am writing the book. It's only after I finish the book,
Only
You're
after.
promoting the book.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah,
on LinkedIn
promoting
also
You're
I see
involved
this as a
while you're
practice.
writing.
People do that.
But this is a good idea. I can do it as and when I write only. As I
Right.
told you, how my recent stories about that fish poison and paralysis.
Right. Right.
That
I also
can
do it
put up.
afterwards.
Beg your pardon?
Sorry. I also do it afterwards, not while I'm writing, but afterwards. A lot of my articles on LinkedIn is about the things I put like in the book, like all those things in the forward and the addendums and all those things I've actually put into articles on LinkedIn. So I'm trying to sort of whet the appetite of like Kurt is saying,
Yeah.
put an installment out there.
Yeah, Kurt.
Mr. Kurt?
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's
It's a very good
marketing
idea. I
101.
just follow it and let me see. I get more readers.
Yeah.
Yes,
I mean, that's the thing that I find is that, again, just kind of re-emphasizing this, your that consistency, and that, you'll hear this all the time with podcasters. I'm gearing up to start doing my own podcast series, but the important thing
I'm
is that
consistent
you're
in a way
basically
that
consistent.
besides my novel, I write short stories, I write poems. So almost every week I am posting something on the social
Good.
media.
Yeah,
I've
and
been
that's
on your
important.
I write a
profile.
lot. But my
I've been on
novel I
Lakshmi's
have not
profile.
promoted. Sorry.
Sorry, Lakshmi, I've been on your profile and I've gone and looked, and it took me like, I think 2 hours to get you through your profile. I was actually tired, before I actually finished because there was because there was so much, and I was very impressed by it, the way that
Really?
you
What
did
was
it.
that? How can it take so much time?
Now, well, I was reading it and I was making copies of it, on the computer. I wasn't just looking at it, because I told Sandeep we need to know about each other and exactly what the other person is doing. Put out the reviews there, talk about the others when we post, talk about the others, and so I started going through you guys' profiles, and
So that's why I see you as visitor of my regular visitor on my profile.
Yes, I see you visit mine a lot. And we need to see that.
Yeah.
And Kurt, have you seen me visit your profile?
I have.
Yeah. Now that is what I mean by collaborating and being involved in each other.
So
I must
that's a
know
good
exactly
beginning.
what you're doing. Yeah.
Right.
I must know exactly. So if somebody asks me, who's Lakshmi? I must be able to tell them exactly. And listen, you write these wonderful books, and we must be as involved in the other person's work than we are involved in our own work. And I feel that if we make that circle wider, we can get a bigger audience than just trying to get people involved in your work. Somebody was saying it's not about what you write. It's not about marketing your book. It's about putting stuff out there, giving them something, and then they will want to buy your book.
Right. Putting out the right stuff for the audience so that they start loving and they start coming to you rather than you asking them to come. That is very important.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's an interesting way. So it is a good beginning, like we visiting profile of each other, knowing that we also start writing like each other, and then we start coming up on the same page. And then when we write, there is no difference. People will not come to know whether Lynn has written it or whether Lakshmi has written it or Kurt has written it. We start owning the audience.
Story.
Right.
That's a good way to come from, to take it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we must be like one family. That's what we're trying to do here.
Right. Yeah. So we'll come to the premise part. So Lakshmi, if you can talk to us about the premise, how do you build a premise, create a premise of a story?
I think generally we start with the premise of I have one idea. That's idea is the premise for my story.
Okay.
Now, how we to go around it, how the beginning and what will be the climax is decided, right? But then elaborating it into chapters and keeping up is this. I think there's not much in. I have not thought about it that much
Right.
because an idea comes to me very fast. Like for this entire story, I was actually writing another novel, and I thought, supposing we are able to fake a murder, everything exactly like a murder. Then I thought, what are the things the police will look for a murder? What are things you have to set up so that the police will take it? And then I said, why should somebody fake a murder? And then like that I connected. So I'm not that sort of an expert in deciding what is my premise.
Right.
The other one I have decided it is some terrorist group who are going to do some DNA alteration for a biowar. Actually, that will sell now in this COVID period.
Yeah, definitely.
Biowar thing is really very important. People, one more step ahead of COVID. So I'm not that much an expert to talk on that.
Okay, so premise probably doesn't hold much importance. So yeah, Lynn, how do you do it very often?
Premise is that's like small themes in a big theme, is that?
Right.
That's, you know, like for instance, if I want to tell the people this, and this is how you know, my books are about teaching the people things, you know. So if I want to teach them, you must eat healthy, then I'm going to set a premise of, listen, these are the old civilizations, you know, so many years back, they ate, you know, like beans and vegetables and that stuff, and they lived so long. So I'm going to try and set a premise and say, listen, because they ate that, that is why they lived long. So I must try and prove that now. So, right. You know, so that is one sort of line through the nonfiction. And that is sort of, and I must now see that this fits in with the main theme, you know, the main theme of talking about the whole medical system. If you live according to this whole medical system and eat right, then you're going to live longer, you know, something like that.
Right. So Kurt has very exact definitions and everything. So Kurt, you tell us something about premise.
Let me echo a little bit of what Lakshmi is saying. Hold on a second. My cat, for some reason, loves to come in when I've got the door closed, and so inevitably I'm just like that. I hear the door creaking open to say, "What's going on in there?" And I think that's actually where a lot of those premises come from. Is that when you are thinking about stories, you know, the writer's mind is constantly playing what if. And, you know, here's an interesting coincidence. What if your cats were able to teleport through doors? You know, it just, and you know, it's actually something I have in Stormcrow. You know, what happens if you know, you have teleporting cats? What if you give cats opposable thumbs? You know, you start with a basic idea and then take it and build it. And, you know, sometimes you end up with situations where, you know, as Lakshmi pointed out, I think it's very much, you know, writers tend to be very morbid people. You know, I know one writer, acquaintance of mine, very good, very well established, wrote on our, you know, mutual writers list or writers group, said, does anyone know what happens when a what happens to a body, how does it decompose when it's basically, um, uh, when you're stabbed at 200 feet below the surface of the sea, or at
Sure.
1,000 feet below the surface of the sea. Does anyone know what actually happens in that particular case?
I don't think anybody wants to know.
No, but the point is that's it's a really morbid thing to think about, but that's where a lot of writers actually kind of start out. It's really kind of it's that seed, that idea of saying, well, okay, where did Arabic numerals come from? How do cats actually get into the room that they're not supposed to be able to? What happens if if your doctor kills your patients? Most writers tend to have a very strange relationship with their librarians if they use research libraries, because they're constantly coming in saying, well, how long does blood remain red? This is the kind of question that will end up putting you on some kind of surveillance list if you're not very careful about it.
You're letting me think now about Bill Gates. He predicted this, he anticipated this, a virus, and he was talking on these TED Talks and telling the people, the governments aren't ready. So, he said, what if, what if there's a virus?
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
And that's the role. I mean, Bill Gates, first of all, is a very interesting person. I've worked for him.
Very, very interesting.
And I've worked for him a couple of times over the last 20 years. Very, very private. Can be difficult to work with sometimes, but he is someone that basically is thinking strategically all the time. And, that's really been one of his great strengths, is that, he's usually thinking 20 to 30 years ahead. And a lot of that really kind of comes down to answering exactly those same kinds of what if questions. What if you can do this? What if a pandemic hits? What kind of reactions are we going to be looking at? How is it going to play out? Will governments respond quickly enough? Will we see, there's lots and lots of questions that basically come out of that. And, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, that's important because you're basically anticipating the market. From a writer's standpoint, that's important because you're basically, speculating and capturing those speculations in print and as you're writing. Again, to Lakshmi's example, what if you had a murder where you didn't have a murder? That premise is then what builds everything else. And usually it's also something that, you then have to kind of follow the tracery of consequences, and see how they end up playing out, which is one of the reasons why writing an ending is so hard, because oftentimes you as a writer don't know the ending until you get there.
Right.
Yeah, you don't, eh?
I wish you did. It'd make my life a lot easier if I actually knew how my novels were supposed to end.
Yeah.
But it usually, I've written, on Stormcrow, I've written probably half a dozen different endings to the same book, and I'm still struggling with that because.
Lakshmi, do you struggle with the endings?
Audio is getting disturbed for me.
Lakshmi, we are wanting to know, how are you comfortable with ending your stories? Are you able to select an ending easily, or do you find it difficult? The ending of your story.
Ending.
Yeah.
I don't find any
Do you
difficulty.
get it easy? Does it come easy? Do you
Yeah,
know before the
that's-
time how
yeah,
it's going to end?
So she has everything clear in her mind, and it's
That's
very
like
rare.
it too.
I'm envious. I wish I did.
Maybe there is
Me
one more
too.
advantage because I live alone. So even when I'm doing my household work like cooking or washing, etc., the story runs on my head. So I have only some difficulty in this. I mean, at least conflicts about which chapter will come when. But for it,
Mm.
chapters to make it more interesting. But
So 24/7, say just thinking about the story ending and story. So probably that's why it is easier for her.
Mm.
Right. Yeah, Lakshmi, you are adding something more?
no, it's
Okay.
okay. That's all.
Okay.
I said it's not difficult. Yeah.
Right. Like the next question is about characters, building characters. Characters are very important, and there are positive characters, negative characters. In our last sessions, we talked about antagonists, protagonists, and all those things. So we are going to have a separate session on characters as well. But right now, I'm just quickly wanting to look at like how to build a character for your story, the main character, the supporting characters. So, Kurt, how do you do that in your story?
Typically, to a certain extent, I think with characters, what you're trying to do is is find out, first of all, what's the point of view character? Who is basically telling the story? Why are they telling the story? What's the basis for it? And that character is essentially what drives the story forward most of the time. But at the same time, that character has to be able to react with others. So, when you're looking at character development, it's usually not just saying, hey, look, I've got one character here. It's I have to think about an ensemble. I have to think about, the character and their best friend and their annoying neighbor and the really creepy stalker guy across the street. And and so as you kind of build out that cast of characters, it's the ensemble relationships that you're looking at that ultimately end up driving how you develop each of those characters in turn. So if you have the protagonist, you want your antagonist to essentially be in a position where they're challenging the character at their weakest points. Essentially saying, what is it that will help this character grow? How do you basically move that character along? And so if you know what that initial protagonist is like, you also have a pretty good idea what the antagonist needs to be like to be able to counter that. And then once you have that relationship sorted out, then you end up with supporting characters that essentially are there to both provide continuity, to give you, in some cases, the means to allow the characters to express their thoughts or to essentially act as a foil for conversations, as well as characters that basically are, neutral, but that contain key information or are in some ways, there primarily to move the story along in some way. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is basically, and this was a suggestion that came from, what's his name? I'll think of it. But anyway, his idea, one thing that he did was to say, when you're developing each character, give them a tell. Give them a particular characteristic that identifies that character immediately to the audience and is something that you can use as kind of a shorthand for indicating, that that character is currently involved in the scene or is in some way, relevant to that particular story arc at any given point. And so, when you're defining your characters in that regard, you don't necessarily need to go that deep, but just something differentiate all of the characters you have so that they have a certain level of identifiable uniqueness. So I've talked enough. I'll pass it on to Lakshmi and to Lynette.
Something I would like to know, the characters, do you have to introduce them all like right at the beginning or in the middle or what? Because say for instance, you have like 10 characters in the story. When do you introduce them all as the story goes along?
Oh yeah, I can't imagine that you wouldn't do that. There are some stories that I've seen where you don't actually see or at least encounter the antagonist until 2/3 of the way through the book. They may be mentioned, they may be, somehow hinted at. You may hear references to them, but you never actually see the antagonist until, well into the book itself.
Well into the book.
There are other characters that are there. They're there just to give a little bit of context. I've been in Stormcrow, for instance. I have a couple of twins that are actually kitsunes, fox spirits, that operate a motorcycle shop. And why or how that comes in, I'm not sure actually where the idea came from, but these were characters. I had a need to be able to get my character from point A to point B, in this case from Seattle to Portland. And I said, okay, I have a character here who has a major limitation. She can't handle cold iron. So she has to basically figure out a way of being able to transport herself from one place to another without using vehicles. And, the idea of saying, okay, well, what if you were to make a magical motorcycle? And at that point, once you had that piece in place, the next step comes down to, okay, once you have a magical motorcycle, this has to be created. Who created it? And that character, those characters then became fairly essential to the overall plot of the story, but they were introduced primarily to fulfill a need, to advance the story initially, and then from that to go back in and say, hey, how does this fit into the broader scheme of things?
So,
Lakshmi?
So I would like to add one thing. Like I haven't written like you guys. I haven't written any novel yet, but I've just started with one. And what I am doing is I have started with the story. The main protagonist is born, and then there is one chapter on his mother, and then he lives for few years. Then one chapter is on his father. Then one chapter is on his sister. Then one on his friend. And then slowly story also moves and the characters also get introduced. And then in the second part, the name of that first part itself is a kind of trilogy, and the name of that first part itself is Charitra, which means characters. The second part is then Kand, where the main body comes in and where everything happens. And the third part is the revenge. So it is kind of the Revenant that I'm planning to write, and which I talked about in my last thing, that I'm bringing mythology and a modern sex scandal kind of thing. So India's biggest scandal that I'm planning to do. So I will be sharing details with you, and we'll see how we can collaborate more on that. But yeah, that's how I am doing. So everyone has their own unique style. So yeah, from Lakshmi, because she has built up a lot of characters.
As everybody said, the character, Kuzori is the main character. that in my stories, they appear right in the beginning. And they
Yeah.
got some specific attitudes and specific characters, which is consistent throughout the story. And it is sort of only for that person. Like in two of my stories, there are police person as the main character. Like this bride story, as well as in another story, the Lingeshwar temple, there is also an inspector. But then their characters are different. Here in this inspector is very strict according to rules, everything law abiding, etc. Well, in the second case, the same type of that inspector is very curious. Even beyond the law, he wants to go, whatever he thinks is right, he wants to some other achieve, even if it is not allowed by police. He's extremely curious and extremely adventurous. That character is different. Similarly, now in one of my stories, which is that, what is called, where a girl, actually she is the main character, Bhumi, she is absolutely have a curiosity. She got a nature of curious to take risk anytime. So every chapter will be finding how can a girl be so daring and do all these things. But throughout the story, she will be exhibiting that. And in my stories, there will be some 30, 40 characters coming in different chapters. But whosoever is that character, you have to shape their behavior to that. Like a fisherman is coming. So his way of talking or what he is expecting about the money, 50 rupees, 500 rupee money was given. That is the important part for it. So accordingly, I write. So there will be various characters, but the main important character, that person, is consistent. But in my stories, as they are suspense stories and thriller, you cannot make out who is the antagonist. Every time in every chapter, I will give some clue that you will start suspecting, oh, this person is the one who is committing. Till the end, you will not be able to decide.
You build a suspense.
So that character will not come out immediately.
Yeah.
But main character, you know, he's this type.
Detective characters in particular are a little bit different than your normal genre because the role of the detective is actually to facilitate the story. The protagonist of the story, the protagonist of the story is the one is the detective, or is usually the detective, but the antagonist is usually the one that's actually far more interesting, largely because your protagonist you've already defined. You've already clearly articulated, especially if that is a recurring character. You've articulated the character's personalities, their likes and dislikes, their phobias, their tics, and your audience will get very upset if you have a recurring character that doesn't maintain that kind of consistency. Unless it's a specific device to promote or to say, hey, wait, there's something wrong here. That consistency of how a character acts becomes very important. But with a detective story, it really does kind of come down to the real interaction is basically in the potential victims and the potential criminal and how they interact. And so oftentimes, the resolution really just kind of comes down to the revelation of, who done it, how did they do it, why did they do it, what's the rationale there. And it's a little bit different from writing, say, an adventure story where you're really focusing on one character as kind of the driving force for moving forward. It's also a challenge that a lot of writers have, having established a basic character and having that character grow in terms of their skill, their competency, their maturity. At some point, they're going to reach a stage where they're no longer interesting or interesting enough to actually work as the primary protagonist for the story itself. And so, in that case, you basically have to use that protagonist character largely almost as a narrator figure, to be able to then say, okay, let's move into the next stage where we can start talking about moving some of the secondary characters into a protagonist role and telling their story and their interactions. But that's a real challenge, especially when you start talking about 5 and 6 and 7 story books or story arcs.
I think what you sort of need to do is sort of break up the book into the beginning, the middle, and the end, and decide which characters belong in the, you know, in which chapters.
Or in which books.
I see it.
Yeah, I mean, that's
any book, yeah, any fiction book.
Because, you know, typically I find when I'm writing, and I suspect Lakshmi does the same thing, you start thinking in terms of universes. You're not thinking in terms of here is a specific story. You're thinking about this from the standpoint of there is a context, you know, a broader story that we're telling here that's going to span multiple books. And oftentimes the context will change as different characters become more prominent over the course of the book, ultimately, you know, culminating in something where those characters are essentially acting in concert to be able to effectively stop the big bad, or, you know, to make the changes that they need to be able to do. And you know, if you don't do that, if you basically have a character that becomes too powerful or just simply becomes, you know, overstays their welcome, then they become what's known as a Mary Sue. They become a character that is essentially too powerful, too perfect, and uninteresting as a consequence. You know, your characters have to
move
be
the story forward.
To move the story forward. You know, if you don't start out with characters that have flaws that need to be fixed, then they're not interesting. You know, Superman is not as an interesting character as Batman is, because Batman is full of flaws. Superman, he's perfect, you know. So nobody does good Superman stories very well because they know that he's perfect. You know, but you know the arc that you have there. And you know, that's the real challenge with writing you know, fiction especially, is that it's not just a matter of saying, okay, I have my characters. You have to think about the story, and then the stories, the overall story that the individual stories are basically working into.
Yeah, you got to keep that consistency throughout the book.
Yeah, and
which
it'll bite you in the butt if you're
at.
not careful. Yes, she is. I've been reading some of her stuff.
She's very good with it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Yeah, I got excellent stories there. Lovely, lovely. We must, you see, that's why we can learn things from you. You know, I did an autobiography, my very first endeavor, an autobiography. And you know how I struggled to move from one chapter to the next. And this was now happening. You know, this was happening at the school, and this was happening. And then I want to talk about something else. And I had a struggle to sort of go from that scene to that scene. You know, that is also something else, except characterization itself. Is hard to move from one scene to another. My brother told me, he said, listen, you know, this is a bit not right here, you know, because now I don't know what happened in between here, from the time that they were in the house to where they were playing outside. What happened in between? You know, it's like moving the characters from that scene to that scene.
I'm never going to write an
autobiography.
An answer
for us
I
there.
will not write one. Precisely for that reason. You know, it's, you know, the problem that you run into when you're dealing, you know, I mean, there's two issues that you're talking about there. One is basically transitions and writing good transitions, but the other is basically it's hard. I would find it hard to write, you know, a biography about me. I find it almost impossible. I think that it well, he sits in a room and he types. The end of the story. The end. We're done. Go.
I wrote it as fiction.
But I think that talking about transitions, transitions are basically flows. It's like a transition in film. There are many devices that you can use to essentially transition from one to the next. And one of the things that I find with a lot of beginning writers in particular, and it took me a while to get out of that phase, is that there is this tendency to want to write every single thing that happened.
Right.
And to become to over delineate the actions to the point where, okay, we don't need to know that this person went to the bathroom unless it is pertinent to the story itself.
Right.
So a lot of that really does comes back down to recognizing that when you are writing a story, there are cues that you can write and little pieces that allow you to make those transitions. But just as long as you're not accidentally making the transitions too jarring, usually your readers will forgive you for skipping a week. If that week was unimportant, not much happened. They won't forgive you for skipping a week if that week happened to be the most important thing that happened to the character. That's a whole different issue. But
yeah. So one thing I would like to add here, we are talking about how characters are introduced. So there was a movie named Slumdog Millionaire, and in this movie, it also won few Oscars. And it was directed by Danny Boyle. So in this movie, how director moved the story was every time a question was asked in who will be the millionaire, and every time the question was asked, the characters were introduced, the events were happening, and it became quite interesting. And it became so interesting that it went ahead and won the Oscar. So Lynn, if you haven't watched it already, you should. Slumdog Millionaire is the movie name. It is quite interesting.
Okay.
And they have given a lot of things about India as well. They have covered India in details, and it has won for music as well, and a couple of other awards in Oscars. So yeah, it can be complex at times building characters, but it is very important. So now I would like to check with Lakshmi about the events. What she does is, I have seen that courtrooms and all, she describes it very vividly, and everything comes out very clearly. So Lakshmi, how do you do that, and how is it that you manage to bring out such minute detailing?
That's because earlier, there was an author, Perry Mason, who's maybe about 50 to 60 stories, detective stories I have read. And they are basically court scenes. And generally, as many stories which I have read, as well as if you remember long time back, this Nanavati case, real Nanavati case was coming at that time. I used to read the paper, every word which was asked by the lawyer. So by reading a lot of questions like that only, I find how the defense, or it depends how our story is moving, whether it is the defense side our story is or on the this one. So that by practice, but sometimes I refer as it is not, cannot call it as a research. Like they are quoting about a car, I'm absolutely ignorant about the car or the price or anything. So I went and referred to all modern car, how much they cost and everything. And about bank, when I'm saying bank manager is going to be questioned, what are the rules of the bank, whether I can go and ask somebody's account and they will reveal that, and all such facts, I do it. But as such, because I'm interested in that questioning, and sometimes people talk to me that you are talking like a lawyer. I don't know. Really because of that. But it has to be like that. Otherwise, some of the cases, I say again, you can quote these serials. things which happen, which never happens in a court. Such absurd things you cannot write. I don't know. Like there was a case where a man has to prove his identity and he got a birthmark. Nowadays, when DNA is there, I don't know why somebody has to show. And the judge asked him to remove his shirt. This is all idiocy. No judge will ask a man to take out the shirt to prove that he got a birthmark. So whenever things are written, they have to be factual. We have to take
Well researched.
and that's my code. I love that. And I feel people enjoy that. So
Right.
that's
So Lynn also does a lot of research before writing, and that's why she takes a lot
but
of time.
she do a lot. I don't do that. Hers is
My
science.
books
She
are
has
all facts.
yeah.
My
Because
books are all
yeah.
facts.
They
And I
are-
hope it's all true though. Yeah. What I do to sort of make my characters is sort of like every chapter has got a like a mini theme, and sort of a mini theme is like a character, you know. So I introduce one character in every next chapter, you know. That's how I can sort of explain my characters in my nonfiction. It's
Right.
mini themes which must fit into this big theme, you know, what
Right.
the book is about.
Right.
So
And then the events.
nonfiction, it's a little bit easier though, but
Yeah.
the research part makes it
No,
difficult.
they are very
You got to
difficult.
get those.
It's very important. Yeah.
You got to get those
Non-fiction is
facts
very
right.
difficult. I try to write some books on almost all the facts I know. How can a student be a brilliant student, which we tell every year to our student. But when I tried to put it on writing, it was impossible. After first chapter, I couldn't move.
And there will be
Yeah.
people to point fingers. You can't tweak anything there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Kurt.
Also, what I'm
yeah.
thinking is, dialogue in fiction. Dialogue is very important to
Right.
move the, you know, the rhythm and the theme along, you know, the story.
Even the characterization part, dialogues, how a particular character speaks. So Lakshmi
Yes.
one day was telling something about this. Lakshmi, if you can tell us.
Yeah, they had to help to move the story, one. And secondly, it should be appropriate to their character. The dialogue
Right.
they talk, the language they talk, it's according to that character. And
True.
thirdly, it shouldn't become boring, repetitive. I find like, or sometimes very abusive and all that. It shouldn't
Right.
become like that. The dialogue should be very short, and so that the story moves. You shouldn't talk like old. If you remember that Hindi, this one, they will give an example for like that. Those things don't
Yeah. So
fit
the
into story.
audience has also developed. They don't want you to
Yeah.
handhold
Yeah,
and tell
dialogue.
them
Otherwise, they
everything.
will skip the pages. Just write them
Yeah.
minimum.
So
If you ask a question, it should be meaningful. The answer
Yeah.
should be as short as possible and meaningful.
and you should not treat them as
That's
dumb person. Otherwise, earlier we used to writers used to write every minute details.
Why? Oh God. Even now it happens in serial. They give such a huge dialogues, and many times it is repetitive. What this person says, and again this person, for half an hour they talk. So
Yeah. So
Interesting.
yeah.
When I wrote my autobiography in the form of fiction, my first manuscript, the publisher said, "Listen, people don't speak like this." I was using, big words, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to say this, but it wasn't like the character was supposed to speak. Like he says, you will skip the page. The readers will skip the pages because the publisher just said, people don't speak like this. You got to say what they say. It must fit the character.
There's actually some interesting. I made a comment on LinkedIn the other day about that point. It's the difference between exposition and dialogue. Exposition, when you look at it, it all basically comes down to the ear. Our ear is actually normally when it is in rest state, the thing that it hears most prominently and then presumes to get rid of, you don't really think about it, is your blood circulating through your ear. The ear is a drum. It's basically picking up that vibration, and that vibration normally, when you have a rest state, is actually kind of a what's called a trochaic pattern. So it's bump, 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 bump. One accent, one unaccented, and then a rest.
Right.
As the heart basically moves. And so if you're listening to music, or you're listening to people talking, or excuse me, to people giving you an exposition, laying down background, or telling things, the best way to do that is to keep up with that same kind of trochaic pattern. And so exposition tends to be very much trochaic pentameter, or trochaic, sometimes trochaic pentameter, but usually trochaic in terms of its underlying pattern. And we tend to absorb that without necessarily reading too much into it. It's like it bypasses the brain almost, or the conscious parts of the brain. Dialogue, on the other hand, is iambic. Dialogue is basically pump, 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 pump. And so, normally when we're talking, the way that we speak often tends to be much more reflective of an iambic system. It's faster. It's basically the way that your heart is beating when it doesn't have that time, when you're running, or you're excited, or you're scared. And dialogue usually tends to follow that pattern, or it's mixed. You go from trochaic to iambic and back again. And so, it's because of that, the brain acts differently when it's reacting to dialogue than when it's looking at, the narrator's exposition. And that can be used from the effect of an author to essentially establish the rhythm and the importance. And you can use that additionally when you're talking about, things like we were talking earlier about detail. Detail is very important when you're laying down exposition, when you're painting a picture of the environment that you're in, because that affects the color and, the perception that the point of view character has about the environment around them, and the characters that they're interacting with are then colored by that environment. When you get to a point where you have a lot of action, everything speeds up. And a lot of the details that you would normally see in your declarative expositional writing get passed over. You have more dialogue, you have more, less exposition, the pace of it increases, and oftentimes you don't perceive things at the same level, which is consistent with the way that you tend to interact with in an exciting situation. You're not seeing everything around you. You're basically just picking up, bits and pieces and fragments as you're having to make decisions. So yeah, I mean that's a very important part, and not to say that research and other things like that aren't important. I'm sorry?
When we are writing for children,
Right.
that language we use dialogue is absolutely different. Because you have to make all those, he said, eek, the doors use all that noise and everything, you have to write in dialogue because it's for kids.
Yeah,
but,
and
we don't write such things when we are writing for adults.
If you look at Ted Geisel's work, Dr. Seuss, Ted Geisel used iambic pentameter extensively. You look at things like one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. This fish had a little car. This fish had a little star. This fish had a little star. That's all iambic pentameter. It's basically meant to be easy to absorb. It's dialogue centric. It's basically intended to facilitate the way that kids think, partially because kids tend to have a higher heart rate than adults do.
True.
And they're actually much more focused. They don't have that. Whereas if you look at like political speeches, and Shakespeare was a master of this. You look at the in Julius Caesar when Augustus is giving his speech. You're saying, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." That's all trochaic. It's basically using declarative, almost expositional dialogue as a way of being able to communicate, but it also gives gravity and gravitas and weight to what they're saying. And so, that's again, it kind of comes back to shaping the way that you want your characters to be. You want those people that are either important or self-important, will tend to talk more in a trochaic pattern. Those that are less focused in that way, or are more likely to be flighty or quick, or kind of spacey, they're likely to be jumping around and very erratic in terms of their tonal patterns and their the kind of metric that they're using, meter that they're using.
Yeah, so it's got to follow like a song, the rhythm of a song. So the moment you sort of sing out of tune, that's when you have to do something there. And like in my nonfiction, sometimes I can be too explanatory, and that's sort of going out of tune, So you have to sort of trim down, and so that the song, the rhythm goes straight through. Even with nonfiction, you got to decide where you sing out of tune.
That's part of the reason that a lot, especially technical, a lot of technical, and scientific works, especially medical works, are so hard, is because you end up with these things like organic compounds that are just simply not intended to roll trippingly off the tongue. I mean, you talk about deoxyribonucleic acid. That's a mash of
massive word.
It's a massive word, but it's also, from a poetry standpoint, it doesn't fit anywhere. It's got a mix of trochees and iambs and other forms in there, and it's a very dissonant form, and that can be useful. I mean, if you have a character that, or if you're trying to make an emphasis, a point of emphasis, you can often use that that dissonance in terms of how you're getting your metrics and your what's the term I'm wanting? How you're getting the the poetic patterns. If you break them sufficiently, that's a stop that causes the audience to go, wait, what are you talking about? Why I've lost the rhythm here, and that's sometimes good. If you want to basically wake people up, you break the rhythm. And you see that a lot when you get dialogue that's very a lot of shouting or things like that. A lot of that you can play on that dissonance in terms of the metric dissonance to give the impression like it's chaotic and harsh, even going beyond the words. It's getting out of the poetic patterns and into something that forces you to really pay attention.
Yeah, so there are a lot of tricks that you can use.
Yeah.
Sandeep, you're a little bit quiet there.
Yeah. So I just found out that I also have this book from Lashmi.
Okay.
So she had sent me for review, and I was quite interested while I was reading it. So the way she wrote the whole thing. So Lashmi, I want to know, how do you move the story forward? Because that same kind of enthusiasm that I have in the first chapter till the last chapter, every chapter I read with the same enthusiasm. So how do you do that? the maintaining
As
that
far
end
as
flow.
thriller goes, and I think almost it is true for all the stories. Every chapter, at the end, there is sort of a climax. There is a sort of question for which you have to look for answer. And
Yeah.
especially after this book, when I'm developing, when there is a question and he opened the door and he was shocked to see, sentence stops there. So you see the next chapter to see who was there. The story will be talking about some other person. So there will be generally another parallel story happening. And so the person will be just rushing through the chapter to get the answer. And in the third chapter, they will again see.
Right,
So in
right.
each chapter, you build up. Just like in serial also. The moment they stop, they have to
Yeah.
build up a climax so that people will try to see next week. So that's my style.
So
Whether I write kids.
in the beginning also they show a preview, a prelude kind of thing where they build up the whole premise and then the whole story moves slowly. They show the ending first to engage the audience more. And probably these days in web series they're doing it in every series. I see that they give some end part first so that the audience is engaged till the end. What happened? Why this happened? Something like that. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, Kurt. So like moving a story, how do you see it?
I mean, that's part of it. You know, you want to. Um, oh, why am I blanking on his name? Um, Butcher, Jim Butcher. Okay. Yeah, Jim Butcher wrote or writes, and I think he's got one more that I haven't had a chance to read yet. But he writes a number of different novels. But one series in particular that he's well known for is the Dresden series. And you can argue about some of his characterizations and so forth, but as a writer he's very effective, and he's effective precisely because he does much the same thing that Lakshmi is talking about. You're it's the chasing a bear up a tree story, or being chased by a bear up a tree story. You basically write your story arc so that at the end of the story your protagonist is now up a bear, and up a tree, and there's a bear at the base of the tree, and then you break off to a completely different story so that you've got you've got some tension going in the back of the reader's mind saying, well, but what happened? And oftentimes, that tends to be a good mechanism to be able to throw in something that's more expository, or developing a secondary arc that you're wanting to put into the story that kind of tells the secondaries, not the principal, but the secondary protagonists, what their story is. And it's usually more expositional. And then, once you get past that exposition, bang, you're right back in, and you find that the protagonist has figured out what to do, has managed to slip down the tree, and is now, hurtling down the hill, and the bear is thinking about coming after him. But lo and behold, over in that end, there's a larger bear that's coming along, and it's going to chase him too. And so that idea of essentially building up the climax, and then stopping, resting, so that you've got some time that you can build out those slower expositional pieces while still keeping the interest of the character, or excuse me, the reader. That's very essential. I've got another novel where almost the very last action of the novel is the protagonist gets shot in the heart.
Oh, gee.
Quite literally, the last paragraph, she's shot in the heart. She looks down and she realizes she's just been shot, and she's bleeding, and then fade to black. But that's the nature of the game. You're basically trying to keep the interest of the reader from one section to the next, and yeah, you got to tease a bit. And oftentimes that's also a good time when you get into the next thing or the next chapter, it's often a good time to also build out, well, what's the antagonist doing while all this is going on? While the hero is up in the tree, the antagonist is doing really nasty, dastardly things, and you get involved with them for a bit. But there's still in the back of the mind, okay, I want to know what happens to this guy that's currently been shot. You know, what is he going to die? Well, you know, yeah, but you know, he'll get better.
So I don't really think it matters, you know, what happens to the main character in the end, as long as you can keep the reader's attention throughout the book. And what Lakshmi was saying, ending this chapter like this and starting that chapter like that, makes me think about a tune, you know, a song's tune. You have to end this chapter on this tune, and the next chapter start with that you know, that very following note. You can't sing a different story in, you know, you got to go start that one with that. So, you know, that will tie the two chapters together. It's very interesting though, but what you saying there is, she was shot in the heart. I also wrote a story where I said that one that I wrote, the autobiography, I ended in right at the end about something which was like just up in the air, and my brother said, "But yeah, well, what's happening here?" I said, "No, that's going to carry on in the next story." But
yeah,
you know, as long as he read the whole story, you know, as long as I kept his attention reading the whole book.
It is difficult to justify all the characters in the end. So giving them a proper ending to all the characters.
You can't.
Yeah.
You can't. It's not possible. Remember that your story is a slice of life. You know, it has it's basically telling the interesting thing that happened to this character from this point to this point.
Right.
And there will be more. There is always something that goes on beyond. And because they're such interesting characters, you know that there'll probably be very interesting things. But in general, you know, one of the hardest temptations that I think most writers have to deal with is saying, okay, I can resolve my character arcs, but only to a certain degree.
Right.
Because, you know, it's really kind of a question of, you know, unless you are, if you're writing kind of a multi-arc series, you know, you eventually do have to get to the point where all of the threads do converge, and you can write your epilogue, and you know, this person, you know, goes off happily ever after, and this person dies a horrible death because they were such a bad person. But that's largely incidental to the story that you're trying to tell.
Right. Yeah. And that's why we have the concept of prequel and sequel coming in, where if the book sells, writers are tempted to come up with a sequel and write another part to it. If it doesn't connect with the audience, then they just forget it. So yeah, probably.
Well, I disagree with that. I don't think you write a book with the idea of saying, I'm going to tell a story, and then, okay, I've told a story, now people want to find out what happens next. Because oftentimes, though, I mean, take a look at Star Wars. Star Wars is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Star Wars basically started off as, you know, a pretty hokey story, but it worked for the time.
Right.
And then it did so well that all of a sudden we ended up with one really good sequel, one kind of mediocre sequel, and then 6 really awful sequels, or 3 prequels and 3 sequels that followed after that.
Right.
Because they tried to milk it for far more than the story was worth.
Right.
And it was true. Yeah. Because sometimes you have these sequels and you know, like Never Ending Story. I'm thinking of Never Ending Story 1. That one was great. And then Never Ending Story 2. I went to see that and
Why
I
did
thought,
they
oh my
make it?
goodness, this is not what I expected, you know, it was so bad.
Yeah. So Lakshmi has herself written some sequel kind of a trilogy in sequel. So Lakshmi, if you can elaborate.
But in my case, in the sequel, only the characters.
Characters, not
Yeah,
the
and it
exact.
was meant for children.
Right,
So in each, the characters were same. Like
right,
they
right,
started from 7th standard. In the next story, they will be 8th standard, 9th
right.
standard. Like they grow, and every year one story. That's how
On
I planned
story,
it.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. So
So,
children are able to connect more in
so
that
all the
manner.
characters, like the children, their parents, and there is a scientist.
A new
All these
story.
are constant, same.
Right,
But
right,
the boy is supposed to have some extraordinary power which changes in each story.
right.
And there will be a robo which is created by the scientist, which helps for the boys. That also will be different.
Wow.
And the story will move to different place, like sometime in a jungle, sometime in a river, something of that type.
Right.
So they cannot be
But
exactly
you keep
like
those
the sequel.
characters.
But it is the same kids. So children like it.
Yeah.
Right.
Now,
Kids were
when
the
you were
center,
writing
so
that,
the children like it.
when you were writing that with the first story that you wrote, were you thinking of it as a series?
Sorry?
When you started
sorry.
writing, Lakshmi, you were sure that you will write it in this manner, or when you started writing, then only you thought that okay, I should come up with a second book with the similar characters?
No, actually, when I just was finishing the story, my sister told me you can continue this story, but the boy should not have the same power.
Yeah.
So I just thought of it, and
Okay.
yeah, so the boy should
Interesting.
have another power. So accordingly, then crimes I can think of anything, but only case of in children there will be no violence, there will not be any killing, nobody
Right.
will gun will
Yes.
come. It will
Yeah.
be simple thing. Only police will come and arrest everyone. So there won't be
So
any
that
violence in
proper
the
moral
entire
is there
story.
for
Yeah.
the kids.
And the language, there won't be any bad language for
Right,
children. Simple
right, right.
language. That's
Well, although that makes a lot of sense. I mean, when you're writing children's and even young teen
sorry, I can't
fiction.
hear.
Oh, sorry. When you're writing, teen fiction and the like, or adolescent fiction, that's a little bit different issue because as you point out, what you're doing there is essentially saying yes, the characters are basically what you're building on, and the idea that they're episodic. They're not really meant to be a single continuous narrative. There may be some references back to them, but they're basically self-contained. And that's a little bit different than when you're talking about a series. I with Stormcrow, I'm definitely writing a series. I'm laying the ground for characters and development of the story arcs that I may not actually use or even resolve in the first book. In some cases it'll be in the second or third, or I've not quite got the fourth mapped out, but I'm getting there. And each of those is essentially something where the actual story is not the book. It's something that spans it's probably about a 1,600 page novel or not novel series, but that's a deliberate choice going in. And I think that when you're writing, you have to be thinking about, okay, is this the end for this, or am I basically establishing a character and a milieu and a set of world issues that are going to essentially have life beyond this one story? And if so, the way you write it is different. You can afford to leave plot devices unexploded, if you will, because they'll show up 2 or 3 or 4 books down the road. Or you can afford to lay down secrets and backstory to be able to do it. And actually that kind of comes back to something that you were mentioning earlier when you were saying you're starting working on your novel. Keep in mind that the value that you're producing as the writer is that you're not necessarily telling a biography. You are basically telling a story. You are looking at it and saying, of all of the things that this particular character has done, what are the things that are going to be most relevant to the reader? And how can you highlight those? And so, one of the things that you want to avoid, as a writer, yeah, you should probably develop the backstory. You should know when were they born, what were the issues involved, what traumatic events happened when they were children or when they were in college or things like that. But they're not the story. They're simply pieces that allow you to flesh out the protagonist and to, help to move the story along.
Right.
So, as you're thinking about that, think about that from the context that, your story here is basically that segment of interest that, may extend across an arc, but it's probably not going to start from the time that they're teething.
Right.
It's probably going to start when they're, maybe 30 or 40 or, I've got one story that starts with someone that's 97 years old. It does tell a story, but it's told from the story of a time traveler. And that was fun. That was a lot of fun because it basically had this romance where the wife is the time traveler and, moves through various stages and interacts with her husband at all points in his life, just not in the same sequence.
Right.
And that was, I think the only problem with it was that the wife also ends up becoming the mother of herself. But that's a whole, that gets into Squick territory, but that was actually one of my published stories is in an anthology on steampunk was this story where the protagonist and the protagonist and her lover were essentially moving through time and meeting one another at different, in different relationships, and different ways of interacting with one another, not realizing that they were actually the same people. And
you have to think outside the box.
Oh God, you need to think about 3/4 of the way to the next county. At that point, I know that one was a mind twister to write. It really was.
Interesting. So we are coming towards an end, and last couple of questions I would like to quickly pop up. I want to know about conflicts, since we all are very matured. You all are very matured writers, and you write very matured stuff. So, Kurt has been talking about arcs. So, Kurt, if you can tell us, how do you develop that conflict, and why is it important, and how it can be developed in a story?
Conflict is basically the action that the protagonist needs to overcome in order to grow. And so it's a necessary evil. It's hard to write conflict, especially if you're,
right.
If you're the person who normally tends to eschew contact or eschew conflict as much as I do. I'm not a big conflict type of person, but it's something that if you don't have it, your story is going to be dull. You need to basically have the conflict in order to be able to build tension between characters. Oftentimes the conflict will mask other relationships and other emotions that one character has for another. Oftentimes conflict is also necessary for resolving fundamental problems that the character has in order to be able to recognize, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I need to do something different. But, it's that inner turmoil that comes from these conflicts that essentially are necessary to move the character forward, necessary to build that character dynamically. So if you don't have conflict, you don't have a story.
True. True. The conflict is also there to keep the reader's attention throughout the book. You know, you got to throw in these spikes.
Yeah.
You know, what if you trip over this? Lakshmi, what do you feel?
Again, the same thing. The conflict is actually the very life of the story, which keeps the story moving ahead.
True.
Now, the conflicts can be in various methods, like the conflict one can be in some time with the self. So where the person, he thinks of an action and which he himself is questioning whether he's doing it right. Sometimes the conflict can be with the,
Right.
like many times monologue in movies and all, they would stand in front of the mirror and that reflection will be talking that way. And the secondly, sometimes with the environment, there is so many difficult obstacles which he has to come and he has to fight the situation. And sometimes it can be conflict with other character. And many times it is a conflict with the unknown. Like in especially fiction, criminal is somebody unknown. He is very close to you and every day you don't know who is going to be murdered next. So this is a very dangerous situation and the person is desperate and this type of conflict. So the conflict is the basic line which is a life which also hooks the readers to the book.
Yeah.
Story.
Got to involve the reader, yeah. It's actually to keep the, you know, what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
So talking about the climax, Lynn, how do you do it, the climax part of it?
The climax part, after you've got all your mini themes and all the chapters, I usually write like 10 chapters in a book, and you've like divided all these chapters into sections which belong to another theme. Then in the end, you got to sort of, remember now, what is your book's name? What is this actually about? Is it about extending your life? Or is it about archipathy, the whole medical system? So in the end, the climax has got to not sort of deal with your byline. It's got to deal with your main thing. Now, listen, I'm trying to tell the people about a whole medical system. And that is why you got to eat right and do this. And, so in the climax, in the end of nonfiction, is really just coming back to the main theme. And if it doesn't, you've actually failed, if it's just telling the people how to eat right and not, looking to your main theme, archipathy, a whole medical system, then why you got to eat right anyway? Just to live longer? No. It's because you, no, it's not just to live longer. You're trying to tell them about this whole medical system. And that's why you must eat right. So you've got to remember that main theme, bringing all the loose ends together.
Right,
in the end.
Yeah. So Kurt, how do you do it?
I tend to treat the climax as the end state of like a Bach fugue. If you listen to Bach, it's there's often multiple themes that play off in variations, and you introduce story arcs and they weave back and forth, and none of them ever actually completely resolve. They actually end up creating more tension or moving the story a little farther, but their purpose is again to build up tension, to build up the suspense in the story. The conflict is where you finally take all of those threads, all of those arcs, and weave them together into the final resolution that you're talking about. It's that ending. It's the okay. Have I essentially proven that the character has grown? Have they effectively defeated the underlying problems that they were facing at the beginning of the story? And you know, if they've done this and they have basically surmounted the challenges that they have or that they have been facing, oftentimes, you know, with the hard test of some sort, then you can basically resolve those arcs. You can lay in the ground for new arcs to build as necessary.
Right.
But realistically, that's the whole purpose of that climax, is just to say, you know, you have this period where you're trying to complete the story that you started with. You know, you're trying to get back to that point where you can prove that the character is grown. You can prove that, you know, you've resolved the problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is perfect. It just means that your character is now more complete than they were before.
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, I'll
Yeah.
pass
So
the baton over to Lakshmi on that, because I'm
yeah.
interested in it.
Lakshmi, like, are you always sure about your climax right from the beginning, or while writing you sometimes
Yeah,
change the
not,
climax?
yeah. No. Climax I have already pre-decided, but then the chapter is written so that the climax is still becoming more and more super, and people are left gasping because that's most unexpected. In all thriller story, it's that way. So I know what is going to happen, but then actually writing it is planned as and when I write the chapter.
Right.
It must be, and as I told you, in a thriller story, it's actually every chapter requires a miniature climax. But the
Right.
end climax should be a super one, most unexpected. When you're reading the entire 200 page, you would not have guessed this is what's going to happen. And I feel that is the, what you call, the gist of your story.
So that's why Lynn
It's like
always starts
putting
from the climax and then backwards she reads and then decides whether to go ahead.
Maybe
it's like putting a cake in the oven, Lakshmi. I don't pop the oven. This, you know, the cake has got to rise, and you know, you got to have it in so long and not longer than that, and in the end, it's got to be a perfect, you know, sort of perfect cake. It's, you know, it's not gonna say you're gonna bake it perfect, but at least if you have a nice birthday cake in the end, then I think it can be sort of compared to putting a cake in the oven and letting it rise properly and not fall flat.
Mhm. One of my favorite writers is Terry Pratchett, who passed away last year, maybe a couple years ago now. And I love Terry's books. You know, just an absolutely fabulous writer. But the thing I liked so much about his books was that when you reach the climax, and when you kind of hit that point where, you know, the resolution has come in and all of the threads that were out there have basically tied together, you go, oh, wow, I see things in a
Wow.
whole different light now. And
True,
you know, I
true. Yeah.
think that's true. You know, I think that's true for Lakshmi's work. I think that it's true, you know, for most good writers. That, you know, the goal for the writer is not just to get over with the book; it's to basically leave your audience with a new perspective. Because keep in mind that, you know, your protagonist is basically your reader surrogate. You know, the reader is basically identifying with the protagonist, and it's not just the growth of the protagonist that's important, it's the awareness in the reader as they finish the book about new concepts, new ideas, or new ways of looking at things, that I think is really where the value comes, the gift that Lakshmi is talking about, of being able to say, okay, I see the world in a different light now. Suddenly it all makes sense. And yes, that guy really was the bastard that I thought, but I was not sure of until, you know, the final moment.
Right.
Um,
Interesting.
Yeah. So, we are coming towards an end. Like it is almost like we have crossed the deadline. So, everyone, I will come back one. I will like to ask one by one anything that we have missed out, or you want to summarize something or tell something. So, Lynn, starting from you, if you would like to tell something on today's discussion, if you would like to add something. We had a lot of
About
topics.
today's discussion, well, what Curtis just said, I've actually just realized it's not to tell a story, you know, and I hope we didn't put off some aspirant writers today by discussing it so deeply and making it like a real recipe, you know. So the thing is just not to just tell a story, it's to tell a lesson, some life lesson, and or educate, or I see it this way now. You know, that's got to be like the end of the story. This has got a different aspect, you know. So it doesn't matter how you write it. It's as long as you get a cake that grows perfectly in the end.
Right. So, Lakshmi,
I think we've really put off some aspirant writers.
That's true. That's true.
It's our intention.
Not
Lakshmi, if you want to add something.
Oh, nothing. We have discussed all that.
So we have touched quite a few topics. Kurt, from final words from you.
A little bit about denouements. After you tell the story, after you've reached that climax, the next piece is to basically calm the writer down, you know, to move away as quickly as possible.
It's very difficult.
It can be, but you know, the idea of, you know, one of the things that I think tends to make writing so hard is often writers don't know when to stop. They don't know when, you know, they don't know where to start. And then, you know, which is why you'll often hear writers, and that's true. And then why you hear with writing coaches, they'll say, you know, if you take your story and, you know, chop off the first 10 pages, you're probably going to end up with a better story. You know, there's a lot to be said for that. But the same thing basically works with denouements. You don't want after the climax hits, you really don't want to dwell too much longer on this, because your whole reason for telling the story is the impact from the climax. And the quicker that you can move off that climax, the better. Except for the possibility of saying, okay, I'm now going to lay an Easter egg, or I'm going to lay in you know, would be a Chekhov's gun for something that I can pick up in the next segment or in the next book. But that's really about the only good reason for having that denouement go much longer than a couple of pages.
Right. Interesting. So, so I will wrap it up for today here, and probably we'll catch up again with another few more interesting questions on storytelling. So thanks a lot for joining, everyone, and it was nice talking to you, and we will connect again. Bye for now. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Pleasure meeting all of you.
Bye.
Likewise.
Bye.